Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to go over a fundamental topic in programming, which is the concept of for loops, and we'll be covering for loops in Java. So the concept of looping over something in programming is used when you want to repeat a task for a certain amount of times. So let's say I wanted to add a variable called x, and I set that to 1. Let's say you wanted to just keep incrementing or adding 1 to that value. So you could do, and I wanted to do it up until like 100. So I wanted to go x, I wanted to increment it until x became 100. So I could do x plus plus, x plus plus, x plus plus. And I keep doing that until it became 100. Now, obviously that would be really repetitive and tedious and wouldn't really be a practical way of going about things. So in programming, we have the concept of loops. And in this video, we're specifically going to be talking about for loops. And what's interesting, what's cool about a for loop is that we can loop for a specific amount of times. And as a programmer, you decide how many times that for loop should execute. So let's actually go over how to write a loop. So in our example, I wanted to increment x by a certain amount of values until it becomes 100. So let's say x is equal to 1. Okay, so to actually increment it to 100 without doing it sequentially, so x plus plus x plus plus, we can use a loop, and we use a for loop. So the way you write a for loop is you write the for keyword, and then you have your brackets. Inside the brackets, you can have 3 statements. So the first statement is what you want the loop variable to start as. So we're setting the loop variable I, that's the convention for for loops, to start at 0. That's the first statement. The second statement is how long do you want this loop to execute? Like, what's the condition for it to continue to execute? In our case, we're going to say up until 99. Because what this is going to mean is it'll start at 0 and it'll go up to 99. And this will result in x being incremented 99 times, and that would make it 100. And then the third statement is what should happen at the end of each iteration, at the end of each loop iteration. So every time the loop iteration ends, we increment I by 1. This is effectively saying I is equal to I plus 1. So if it was 1, it would become 2. If it was 2, it would become 3, and so on. So I plus plus. And inside the loop is whatever we want to be executed in the loop, obviously. So in our case, we want to increment x by 1. Okay, so whatever's inside these brackets, these curly brackets, will get executed in the for loop. So like I said, let's go over the syntax one more time. We have the first statement, which initializes the loop variable I to start at 0. This says how long under which conditions the loop should execute. So while I is less than 99, so then it'll continue executing. When that condition is no longer satisfied, it would exit the loop. And this is the third statement, which is what should happen at the end of each iteration. So we incremented I by 1. So just going through it line by line, basically, we would say we start at 0. We'd increment x, and we'd increment I, and then it would check is 1 less than 99 because the I would become a 1. 1 is less than 99. It will keep doing this until it gets to 99. So once it gets to 99, then it would say no 99. Then it would say 99 is no longer less than 99, and then we exit the loop. And then just to confirm that this is what happens, the final value should be 100. So. And there we go. Now, I also want to go over the use case of looping through an array, which is very common in Java or in any programming language. So here we defined an array called numbers, and it contains the numbers 1 through 5. Now, if I wanted to print each value individually, I could do like numbers index 0, numbers index 1, and so on up until the last value. Now, like I said before, with why we use loops, this gets really tedious and isn't required to do so. So instead, what we can do is we can define a for loop, and the conditions for the for loop is we start at index 0. And also, I didn't mention this before, but the reason why we conventionally start at index 0 is because for the common use case of looping through an array. And when we want to loop through an array and access the first element, but we need to access it through index 0. And that's why we set I equal to 0 for the starting variable. The second condition, or the second statement, is setting I less than numbers dot length. So we loop until the end of this array. So in our case, the length of this array is 5. So while I is less than 5. and you think, okay, well, how am I going to get to the last element? Remember, we start at 0, so it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which corresponds to these values, right? So it's index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3, index 4. So this works fine. And the last value, or last statement, is what happens to I at the end of each loop. So increment I by 1, like I gave in the previous example. And inside the loop, we print the value at index I. So let's see what we get. We should get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all on their own lines, and that's what we have here. Also, let's go over one quick change in terms of these statements here. So let's say I want to change, you can obviously change these values, so I just want to show you what that looks like. So if I set this to I at 1, if we start I equal to 1, then we start at 1 for the loop variable, so we'd actually ignore this 1 here, right? Because we start index 1, which would be here, 2, 3, 4. So, and everything else stays the same. So we go 2, 3, 4, 5. And then if I were to change, let's say, this value to, so at the end of each loop, instead of incrementing it by 1, we could increment it by 2, let's say. So I plus equals 2. So now what would happen, and let's set this back to 0. Now what would happen is we start at 1, then instead of going to 2, I would become 2 here. So instead of going to index 0, index 1, index 2, we would skip index 1 because it would be index 0, then increment 0 by 2, which would become 2. So then we'd go to index 2, which would read this 3, and then we'd skip this 4 because we would increment it by 2 from index 2, which would become index 4. And basically what we print is 1, 3, and 5. And just to showcase that, that's what we get. And obviously you can change this condition to be plus, let's say plus 1. Now, what's going to happen here is there's actually going to be an error because you can't go outside the length of an array. So here we'd go up until index 5 because numbers.length is 5, so plus 1 would become 6. And this would allow us to try and access the index 5, but the largest index in this array will be index 4. So this would result in an index out of bounds error. Sorry, I need to change this to I++ because then the condition is satisfied. So exception in main thread index out of array index out of bounds exception. So that's something you need to be careful with for loops, is the index out of bounds exception. And this is a common error that you'll run into in programming. So just be wary of that. So I'll change that back to this, and we'll no longer get that error. Cool. I hope you guys were able to understand for loops at a fundamental level. They're a really important topic in programming, so keep practicing with them, and the better you'll understand them. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.